Namaste, group hug. Please come and join me on the sofa. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guests from Chicago, which is an area that we don't know much about at Citywealth. So we're really going to get a good insight from Andie Kramer, who is a partner at McDermott in Chicago. Welcome, Andie.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here with you.
And thank you so much for thank you so much for joining us at 6 in the morning. We're very grateful. Good gratitude to you. So, Andie, please tell us a bit about you and your practice. I see from your blog on your website that it spans crypto and tax planning. And in my head, one thing we've been told is Chicago is a big area of private wealth. So maybe you could give the viewers a quick download.
Well, Chicago was really the center of the country, with the railroads and the meat packing. And so a lot of industrial work started and happened here in Chicago. And so Chicago is a place that has a lot of wealth in it. Very prominent families and companies are here in Chicago. And the Chicago River, which runs through around the downtown area, was really the heart of Chicago for many years in the 1800s, early 1900s. And so it's obviously not as important now, but that was one of the magnets to bring people to Chicago.
And on your bio, you talk about crypto. So, I mean, I know in Palo Alto, New York, there's a big crypto investment market and a lot of tech developers. Is that the case in Chicago?
Well, we don't have the tech developers that I work with happen to be in New York and around California. So you're right that's really where the action is on the ground, except that the legal issues can be addressed in across the country. And so because of my tax practice and the work that I do in advising taxpayers as to how to deal with tax compliance as well as defense, what we find is that the tax issues with respect to crypto can be very similar to the sorts of financial product and derivative work that I've worked on over the years. And so it was a natural next step when the crypto market opened up.
So kind of the alternative investment bag.
That's correct. So and it's very popular right now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a strange kind of popular niche, isn't it? That whole sector never seems to get out of it. But there we go. So, how has Chicago been? How has WFH worked from home, and how has the environment been locally with the COVID situation?
Well, we're still working from home here in Chicago. My office, my law firm, we're not sure when we're going to be going back to the office. And I don't think it's going to be going back to the office the way we're used to. But working from home has been just fine for me. I joke with my husband that at least we like each other. And so we've worked together and had shared a home office for years. And so for us, it's really not that different, other than the fact that we don't go to an office. But it's made an enormous change in the workflow, in the way that people can interact with each other. And so I think there's both some positives and some negatives about working from home. Primarily, many of the positives are ones that are reported by many of the men that I work with, who say, I love being at home. I love being with my family. Things that they wouldn't have had an opportunity to do before. But with the schools closed and camps probably not opening this summer, and organized activities for the children and the teenagers, it's put an enormous burden on the women who have full-time jobs.
We'll go on in a minute to more of a business economic environment, but you sent me kindly some links beforehand, and this is a topic of great interest to Citywealth, which is leveling the playing field in the gender battle of work. And for me, I've always felt that WFH would be the thing that leveled it without a lot of corporate interaction, because you literally would have no choice but both of you to look after the children at home. But I see from your links that you're not convinced that that's the case, and actually there could still be this uneven playing field at home.
Well, you're right. The jury is still out. We don't know what's going to actually come next. But in addition to my legal practice, I have written several books, and I'm a Forbes.com contributor about women at work. And what we find is that the studies are showing that the women are still getting the inordinate burden. And so many families have had to work it out where they both work at home, they have children at home, they're going to take turns. Who's going to be responsible? But what struck me as the most sort of shocking was a survey where they asked who from two working parents with children at home, who does the bulk of the at-home learning when the schools were closed. And 90% of the men said that they've taken on the bulk of the at-home learning. And only 3% of the women said that the men had taken over the bulk. So there's a difference, a disconnect in what people see as their fair share. And that's something that's going to need to be worked out and should be discussed by families. But if you have that, if you have that broad of a difference of opinion, you've got a lot of work to do.
It's going to be an interesting time, isn't it? I guess we won't know for a couple of years how that whole thing irons out. So tell us about the business environment in Chicago. I mean, I don't know how connected you are to the rest of the USA, and from Europe, we're getting this message that Florida's not doing so well, but New York is back, and there's a bit of the factories, which we've had over here, a bit of contamination. So how are businesses doing in Chicago? I mean, I know it's a very wealthy district, but what's the environment there for our viewers?
Well, obviously the airline industry, the convention industry, the hospitality industry are very important to Chicago, and virtually all of the conventions have shut down and are either rescheduling for 2021 or have tried to go virtual. And so the tourists and the convention people and the business people that normally come into Chicago aren't here. And that obviously affects the restaurants and the hotels and the hospitality side, not just the convention centers themselves. So it's much slower here in Chicago, but in the United States generally, COVID has become a political issue, unfortunately, instead of a health issue, the way that it should be. And so in Chicago, our mayor has been very strong about sheltering at home, wearing masks in public, social distancing. Our governor has, and so we were on an upswing and we're concerned about that, but we fairly have tapered off. We haven't gone down significantly, but like New York, we were hit early because of the airports, I think is really what the problem was, that people were coming in from around the world to New York, and they also come into Chicago.
I see. So the infection was possibly coming in internationally. Interesting. So in terms of what you're advising your clients, what kind of things what are they ringing you about? And what we've had is in the UK is a lot of wills and succession. People were suddenly very concerned about their transferring of assets, which seems a natural outcome. But have you seen anything else? What are the themes that have popped up for you?
Well, first of all, let me emphasize that making sure that your estate planning documents are in order is critically important. I'm right now working with a very sad situation, a client of mine and actually a good friend who died this past week at 50. and didn't expect that this was going to happen. The problem is that his will was out of date, and it's turned into a mess trying to accommodate both his wishes and what his documents say. So that's really a very important thing that needs to be addressed. In fact, I put a note by my computer to double check ours to make sure that we have everything in order as well. But people are interested in the alternative investments, cryptocurrency. I'm right now working on sort of trying to write about the tax issues, because here in the United States, the government has been fairly silent about the tax treatment. They've come out with only a notice and two little, what are called revenue rulings. And it doesn't address many of the major issues. And so we have people who are actively trading who don't know what they're supposed to do even to fill out their tax returns.
Yeah, it's been a growing topic of interest, I think, in the last year in the UK, that a lot of the accountants are saying, or CPAs, you're going to get a huge tax bill, so you need to have a look at this. But in terms of anything else that's coming up, there's alternative investments, wills and succession. That usually there's something that might be bespoke to the area. So just digging around a bit more to see what you think.
Okay. Well, I know that we've been very active there were a number of transactions that ground to a halt in March that have now started up again. And so I'm hopeful that the pandemic sort of dip is now hopefully leveling off and is starting to work its way up. So transactional work has increased. We have a huge healthcare practice. And so from those sides, we're seeing a lot of that. A lot of advising clients as to how to safely open their offices again. It turns out that that's a very, very hot issue. What are you going to do? Are you going to have pools where there's people sitting close together? You can't do that. And so, for example, we have working on policies for clients as to how do you ride the elevator? What are you going to do about the coffee machine? What are you going to do about the refrigerator? How are you going to handle in-office meetings? And so I think that that's something that we all need to think about, not just as our offices open up, but as we start to interact more and more with people outside of our homes.
We have a club in London called Annabelle's, and that's just reopened, which is sort of a fancy place that everyone wants to go to. And they've got some new thermal static equipment which will zap all viruses, and plastic screens around each table in the dinner hall and all sorts of stuff. And police sort of protocol people, their staff have been nominated as people to go over and psychologically tap someone on the shoulder and keep them in alignment. But it's an interesting world, isn't it, for hospitality to enforce that. So how does that, it takes away a lot of the fun, and people are a bit like, oh gosh, is this, we're trying to work out if it's still enjoyable to go out for a meal, to be honest.
Well, I have to say that my husband and I went to the Chicago Club, which is a club that I belong to here in Chicago, and they've opened up their tavern, the terrace room, which is outside, and that was as adventuresome as we got. But well, Chicago has not opened up inside dining yet.
So do you see this idea, if we've interviewed some wealth managers in the UK and they feel that there'll be a big change with sustainable investments, which is a bit alternative as well, and a new idea of a sort of big society capital, in that people won't be so focused on making money, but more about stakeholders and humanistic kind of outlook for the corporate world. I have to say, during the Zoom COVID period, I've not felt that was happening. And a lot of people's staffs that we're dealing with and doing Zoomies with seem very, very tired of the very corporate model that's come out into this Zoom world. But how do you think that will come out? And do you see a new society?
I would hope that we could see a new society. I think that the corporate statements about racial justice and equality, as well as sustainability and investing in human capital, I think are really very important. But we've seen talk is cheap. And so the hard part is going to see if we can actually, if there's actually going to be changes. And that's really what we need to focus on. A number of the organizations that I'm part of, the National Association of Women Lawyers, for example, we're right now working on what we're calling a diversity and inclusion toolkit for uncertain times, where we're focusing on what organizations need to do to make certain that they don't throw the women and the people of color under the bus, which is very often what happens in a contracting environment, or when people are frightened, they tend to cluster around people that are like them. And so we need to make sure that all of the advances that we've had in the last 10, 20 years don't get wiped away in 3 or 4 months. Yeah.
So what are the key takeaways from those articles that you've written?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that we have to start these difficult conversations. A lot of what we're talking about involves people talking and listening to each other, understanding the other person's view, whether it's who's going to take care of the children when dad has a Zoom call or mom has a Zoom call. Those are very important conversations that sometimes are difficult to begin. And so we have to start those conversations at home and with our colleagues to make certain that we're moving forward positively. And so I think the first takeaway is thinking about it is one thing, doing something about it is another. But the way that you can get from thinking about it to doing something is to start conversations that may be difficult. And that's really what we have to do.
And you can say yes or no, but the Black Lives Matters, I think you mentioned it to me before we had the interview. What's the update on the Chicago situation?
Well, we still have protests. Unfortunately, Chicago's a city that has experienced an increase in homicides, which is very, very horrifying. And I think that perhaps as with the killing of George Floyd had created sparked the protests nationally. Small children are being killed in Chicago, and that is sparking a backlash and an outrage. And the communities are saying we have to do something differently. And so hopefully that's another point about conversation, because the violence is focused in neighborhoods which have been the hardest hit by COVID, the hardest hit by the financial the financial crisis that we're facing right now. And so it tends to be located in areas where people don't have any hope and don't have any opportunities. And so that's really on the whole city and all of us to try to make certain that we can change that dynamic.
So a bit of work to be done going forward. So give us an update on your practices and the kind of clients you've got, and who should be calling you up so we get a lowdown on you.
Well, I do a lot of family office and high net worth investment, not giving investment advice, but doing the investment, negotiating transactions, doing derivative contracts, planning to get the best tax result that you can get. And so that's a key part of my practice. But another part of it is working with businesses on their use of financial products and derivative transactions, and hedging, very important now with currencies and commodity prices in flux. Trying to lock in a favorable price is something that's my clients are very concerned about right now.
And are you seeing restructurings and renegotiations for investments or for purchases?
Well, the firm is seeing it. I haven't seen it yet, but I know that a number of businesses have started from the real estate side to try to renegotiate their real estate contracts, trying to, if they've been prevented from being in their office for 4 months, a number of big companies are just not paying their rent. And so there's issues that are coming up with respect to that. The courts were closed up until very recently. And the way that litigation is going forward had been basically on a hiatus and a break. And so we don't know really what's going to happen in that regard. If we can see China and what happened in China, the divorces and the family separations were dramatically increased. I don't do that sort of work, but a friend of mine does. And I don't think she can barely sleep dealing with all of the crises that are coming up. And so those are situations where people have been sheltering in place, working from home. And unlike my situation where I enjoy being with my husband, there's situations where families are splitting up and not having the conversations that they need to.
So we saw a bit of that in the UK. There was a lot of media saying there's going to be lots of divorces. And I have to say, for the first couple of months, that was not the case. People were very happy and they were out cycling and jogging. But it does seem to have kicked in a little bit in the last couple of weeks. Whatever irritations were surfacing seemed to have, the lid's come off the pan, shall we say. I think
that's right.
A bit of an upsurge there.
Yeah.
So give us some advice. What you've got really good information on gender, working from home. You've got top of the world clients. You're dealing with a big pocket of wealth in Chicago in the States. So if you had to pick out 3 bits of advice that are at the top of your head at the moment, what would you give to our viewers?
Well, one is one that they've heard already probably 100 times, which is make sure that your estate planning and your family documents are in order. You want to be sure that you do that. Another piece of advice I would think is start difficult conversations, business conversations, investment conversations with your family, to try to make sure that you are working together and the lid is not going to fly off that pot. I think the other thing is that this is a situation that none of us have ever experienced before. And what we have to keep in mind is that the historical, it takes these many years to recover from financial setback, none of that is really historical information that can apply here. And so we don't know. It may be that if we were having this conversation in 6 or 8 months, we would be having a totally different conversation. And we would be focused on different things. So right now, I would say, I'm optimistic that both the family and the economy are going to come out of this even stronger. So that's really my sense, which is don't get discouraged. People can get discouraged very easily. And I would say we don't know yet what even to be dealing with. So
I agree with you. There is a sense of bleakness in the air and a lot of discouragement. People were talking to me and everyone seems to have a message about, oh gosh, are these people going to survive? Or, is there going to be a second spike? And that seems to be prevalent, doesn't it? Rather than actually we're through it, we've learned a lot of lessons and actually we're more prepared, aren't we, if anything more happens. But there is a story in the UK. It's probably not something that USA viewers might be aware of, but we had mining in the UK in the 70s, and the economic review of that now 50 years on said that even though they reskilled and retrained people, it actually takes one whole generation for an area to recover from a mass loss of jobs or a loss of a particular industry. So I hope that's not the case, but if it is, the governments need to prepare for almost one whole generation, maybe 30 years of, not quantitative easing maybe, but actually a lot more long-term training and reskilling than just 1 or 2 years and we're back and it's your fault and why didn't you get a job? It's a bit more of a bigger impact. So thinking about COVID, how do you see, let's look back in 2 or 3 years time? We've obviously had a bit of a chat and we're looking at a bit of a wait and see from what you're saying. But do you have any thoughts 2 years down the line? I mean, how will Chicago be?
Well, I hope it's not just a fantasy and that it's a reality, but I'm very hopeful that with all of the brain power and the resources that are being devoted to understanding COVID and trying to figure out how to develop a vaccine, I think that that's really what we're going to need to be hoping for. In the meantime, I think the plastic shields are going to be very popular in schools and in restaurants and clubs and stores. And so I think that the world is very different now. In many ways, it reminds me of dealing with people who had lived through the Depression, who then many years later are very comfortable or extraordinarily wealthy, but still can remember and think back to those days. And I think that it has definitely changed people's perspectives. And so 2-3 years from now, I'm hoping that we will all be more optimistic, that we will be more, that the world will be more on an even keel, and that we will have figured out many of the social injustice issues and making the most of our human capital. But again, I think that you have to be looking forward positively.
I went to Singapore in just this early in the year, and actually they had SARS, which we didn't seem to experience so much in America or Europe, but right. They're all completely back. Everything's back to normal. There's no sense of any strangeness. The flights are in and out. Conferences are going on, but it was 15 years on, so who knows? But things do definitely go back to normal in the end, even if perhaps they're a bit nicer, as you're saying. So I just want to say to viewers that we have these sessions every Tuesday and Friday, and we would love it if you enjoyed this interview with Andie to press a thumbs up. And if you could subscribe, then you will get notifications to come and view the very different people that we interview all over the world in the private wealth industry. And I would like to say thank you so much to Andie for joining us at such an early time from Chicago. And blessings to you, and keep safe, and we look forward to seeing you when things recover.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed talking with you.